Snow whispered against the windows of Lady Wetherell's ballroom as if London itself were trying to hush the cruelty of its own gossip. Candlelight shimmered over floors polished to a glass-like sheen, gilded mirrors caught fragments of silk and diamonds, and violins wove a slow, gilded melody meant to make hearts flutter and fortunes collide. Every young lady stood a little taller beneath the glow, every ambitious mama hovered like a general commanding her troops. It was the winter season, the season of wagers disguised as marriages, of dances disguised as promises. And in a far near-forgotten corner, stood the one woman who wanted nothing from it. Miss Rachel Fairhaven, 24, plain in her dove-gray gown trimmed with modest lace, held her gloved hands together to keep them from trembling. She had not come for dances or prospects or flirtations draped in flattery. She had come only because Lady Wetherell employed her mother once, and it would have been rude to refuse the invitation. Besides, it was whispered that the lady of the house sought a governess for her nephews. Rachel clung to that faint hope the way some young debutantes here clung to visions of dukes and coronets. A governess post promised independence, dignity, and a life far from the fragile whims of wealthy men. That was all she wanted, a quiet life built by her own capabilities, not the precarious kindness of society. She waited for the moment to approach Lady Wetherell, waited for her courage to rise over the sting of being ignored by everyone else. No gentleman asked her to dance. She doubted any had even looked at her long enough to know her gown's color. The other young women exchanged subtle, triumphant glances each time an eligible bachelor crossed their paths. They seemed to glow with expectation, while Rachel felt like a shadow clinging to the far edge of the room. At last, as the musicians paused and conversation swelled, Rachel stepped forward, smoothing her skirt even though she knew it did little to disguise its age. Lady Wetherell stood near a tall arrangement of winter roses, laughing among her circle of friends, her pearls gleaming like drops of frozen moonlight. Rachel approached with gentle modesty, bowing her head. "Lady Wetherell," she began in her soft, careful voice, "might I speak with you regarding—" The lady lifted a hand, stopping her before she could finish. "My dear, are you quite sure you're in the correct hall? The ladies' retiring room is in the opposite direction." A ripple of laughter stirred among the surrounding women. Rachel's cheeks warmed in the coldest way, the humiliation sinking deep into her ribs. "I only wish to inquire," Rachel managed, "whether the governess position you mentioned last month remains available." One of the matrons leaned toward Lady Wetherell, her voice loud enough for all to hear. "A governess? Here? Tonight? She does not even have a dance card worth reading." Another giggle, sharper this time. Rachel lowered her gaze, but not quickly enough to avoid seeing the amusement in their eyes. It pressed into her like a winter draught beneath a thin door. "Perhaps another time, Miss Fairhaven," Lady Wetherell replied, her tone polite but glacial. "We are quite occupied this evening." With that, they turned away, leaving Rachel with the hollow ache of being dismissed not merely as a potential governess but as a woman entirely invisible. She forced a breath through her lungs, steadying herself in the wake of their disdain. She reminded her heart, fiercely, firmly, that she did not come seeking their approval. The sting would fade. It always did. Or so she hoped. The music swelled again, the chandeliers flickered brighter, and in that moment, a murmur spread through the ballroom like wind racing along frostbitten branches. "The Duke," someone whispered. "He's here. Look, Ashbourne has arrived." Heads tilted. Fans fluttered. Young ladies straightened their posture with such haste it seemed their ribs might crack from the effort. Even the musicians faltered for a second before recovering. The Duke of Ashbourne entered the ballroom with the air of a man accustomed to admiration yet untouched by it. His silver hair glinted like steel beneath candlelight, his posture spoke of years on battlefields, and his expression held the quiet gravity of a man who'd faced more storms than society could imagine. At 42 he was the most sought-after bachelor in London, though bachelor hardly described him. He was a legend dressed in tailored black wool and winter charisma. Women angled themselves in his path like jeweled constellations hoping to catch moonlight, but he barely glanced at them. He nodded politely, his gaze scanning the room with the weary focus of a man accustomed to searching for threats, not favors. And then he saw her. Across the ballroom, tucked near the marble column where shadows softened every line of her face, stood Rachel Fairhaven, the only woman who did not alter her breath or posture upon seeing him. She simply existed as she had before, quietly, steadily, as though his presence meant nothing at all. That was when his expression changed. A flicker, faint but unmistakable, of curiosity, of recognition, of something dangerous and alive stirred within his winter-steady gaze. He crossed the ballroom without hesitation. Rachel did not see him until he stood directly before her, his shadow mingling with hers. She stiffened, startled by the sudden closeness of a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire room. "Miss Fairhaven, is it?" he asked, his voice low and deep, carrying the softness of controlled thunder. She blinked. "You know my name, Your Grace?" "London speaks of many things," he replied, "but not all of them warrant belief." She instinctively stepped back. He offered his hand, a simple gesture, elegant and unmistakably public. "Would you grant me the honor of a dance?" The ballroom fell silent, unbearably, painfully silent. Rachel felt every eye upon her, felt the expectation tighten around her like a corset pulled too sharply. To accept would plunge her into gossip far deeper than she already swam in. But to refuse. She lifted her chin. "I thank you, Your Grace," she said quietly, "but I do not wish to dance this evening." A gasp swept the crowd. The Duke's brows drew together, not with anger, but with something far more difficult to decipher. Understanding. An interest. He inclined his head. "As you wish, Miss Fairhaven." The murmurs began before he even stepped back. She refused him. Is she out of her mind? She'll regret that. Heat rushed to her cheeks, burning through her composure. She forced herself toward the exit, wishing the snow outside could swallow her whole. She did not look back. But as she reached her waiting carriage, a voice cut softly through the winter air, quiet, intimate, utterly unexpected. "Miss Fairhaven." She froze. The Duke stood beneath the gas lamp, snow collecting on his shoulders, his expression unreadable. "How?" she whispered. "Do you know my name?" The answer hovered on his lips, but he spoke nothing. Not yet. Rumor traveled faster than any carriage along London's frostbitten streets, and by dawn the entire city seemed to hum with a single tale. The silver-haired Duke of Ashbourne had asked a rector's daughter to dance, and she had refused him without a tremor of hesitation. Parlors, bakeries, milliners' shops, and gentlemen's clubs each added their own seasoning to the story, until it tasted far richer than the truth. Some insisted she had insulted him deliberately. Others claimed she had fainted from terror. But the version that clung most stubbornly to the city's imagination was the cruelest, that she had attempted to capture his attention by playing hard to win, and had failed with spectacular inelegance. The lies grew like frost on glass, thin but bitter, and Rachel Fairhaven felt each one settling over her life as she prepared for another day of searching for work. She tried to breathe through it, to remind herself that gossip was only noise, yet the noise echoed everywhere she turned. When her landlady delivered her morning tea, her look bristled strangely, as if speaking to someone who had overreached her station. Rachel sat straighter, determined not to shrink beneath a world that never bothered to understand her. The governess advertisements in the newspaper blurred slightly beneath her gaze, though she traced each line with careful hope. She folded the paper, stepped into the winter morning, and made her way down the fog-clad street toward Piccadilly with her dignity wrapped as tightly around her as her woolen shawl. Shops were opening as she passed, lamps flickering to life behind frost-kissed windows. Hatchett's bookshop stood ahead, its interior aglow with soft candlelight that shimmered across shelves filled with leather spines. Rachel entered quietly, grateful for the hush that greeted her. The scent of old paper, pine wood, and winter-damp coats seemed to soothe the bruised corners of her spirit. She made her way to the reading table near the window, searching the employment registry kept for women seeking respectable positions. Before she could turn a single page, a shift of the air, subtle, heavy, unmistakable, made her look up. The Duke of Ashbourne stood a few feet away, a figure carved from winter light, snowflakes melting upon the shoulders of his dark coat. His presence transformed the quiet bookshop into something charged, as though every dissolved snowflake carried electricity. Rachel stiffened, unsure whether to curtsy, flee, or ignore him entirely. She chose the fourth option, to simply remain still and composed. The Duke inclined his head in a manner far gentler than she expected. "Miss Fairhaven," he murmured, voice low enough to keep curious ears from catching his words, "I hope you will forgive the impropriety of addressing you here. I wished only to offer an apology for last night's discomfort." Rachel felt a tremor of surprise. He had not caused her humiliation, society had. Yet he seemed to claim responsibility for all of it. She lowered her eyes. "There is nothing to apologize for, Your Grace. I ought not to be the subject of such attention at all." His jaw tightened, the faintest muscle twitching near his temple. "Attention is often a burden," he said, "but never one you deserved in such a form." Before she could respond, a group of women entered the shop, their laughter blending with the jingle of the door. Upon seeing the Duke, they froze, Then they noticed her standing beside him, and a rustle of sharp amusement passed among them. Rachel felt her breath narrow. She stepped back, determined not to fuel another storm of speculation. The Duke's gaze followed her movement, something troubled flickering there. "I will not disturb your morning," he said softly. "But Miss Fairhaven, please know that London's cruelty reflects London, not you." Then, with a slight bow, he disappeared into the stacks of books, leaving her pulse irregular and her thoughts disordered. Rachel forced herself to resume reading, though nothing on the page would settle into meaning. She left the shop soon after, stepping into the brittle cold with a sense of vulnerability she loathed. The winter wind stung her cheeks as she walked toward Mayfair, where one of the families had invited her to inquire about a governess post. When she arrived, she found the door open and the drawing room filled with young ladies in jewel-bright gowns. They whispered among themselves, eyes bright with mischief. Something felt wrong. Before she could turn to leave, one of the girls lifted her voice. "Do come in, Miss Fairhaven. We have heard so very much about you." Soft giggles followed. Rachel swallowed hard, realizing she had been summoned not for employment, but for entertainment, her embarrassment their amusement. She turned to leave at once, heart pounding, but a shadow filled the doorway. The Duke of Ashbourne stood there. His presence eradicated the room's laughter in a single breath. Every girl straightened, every whisper died. His voice was cool, each word honed like a blade. "Ladies," he said, "I trust you understand the cruelty of this charade." The hostess paled. "Your Grace, we were only humiliating a woman," he cut in, "for sport." He stepped to Rachel's side without touching her, yet the gesture felt like the firmest protection she had ever known. "Miss Fairhaven," he said quietly, "allow me to escort you out." She followed him, too stunned to refuse. The cold outside felt sharper after the warm cruelty within. She walked beside him in silence, her breath forming pale clouds in the crisp air. When they reached the edge of the square, she paused. "Your Grace," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, "you should not involve yourself in my affairs. It will only worsen matters." His gaze held hers, winter steady and piercing. "If matters worsen," he replied, "the fault will be society's, not mine. Nor yours." She felt something inside her fracture, not in pain but in recognition. For the first time, someone spoke not to dismiss her or judge her, but to defend her without expectation. "Why do you trouble yourself on my behalf?" she whispered. There was a long breath between them, one that seemed to stretch from Piccadilly to the Spanish battlefields he had once commanded upon. "Because," he said at last, "I have seen many forms of bravery, Miss Fairhaven. Yours is the quietest, and therefore the rarest." She looked away before he could see the emotion rising in her eyes. When she reached her lodging later that afternoon, a single white winter rose waited on her doorstep, wrapped in nothing but a ribbon the color of moonlit snow. Her heart jolted. She knew immediately who had sent it. Rachel lifted the bloom, intending to return it, but found herself unable to loosen her grip. She placed it inside, telling herself she would dispose of it in the morning. But when dawn arrived, the rose lay frozen on her windowsill, and a second, perfectly fresh one waited outside her door, its petals trembling with the cold. And Rachel realized, with a shiver far deeper than the winter air, that the Duke must have been there before sunrise. A thick white fog rolled over London the next evening, swallowing the gas lamps one by one until the streets appeared to drift between worlds. Rachel tightened her shawl against the cold as she made her way along Grosvenor Square, her breath forming thin ghosts that vanished in the winter air. She had collected her courage all day, trying to convince herself that the second rose, the one left before dawn, meant nothing. Yet the memory of it pulsed like a quiet warmth inside her, unsettling and unwelcome. She had not asked for gestures. She had not invited kindness. She certainly had not invited the Duke of Ashbourne into the fragile order of her life. But the world rarely obeyed the desires of quiet women. Wind swept around the corner, carrying fine flakes of snow that clung to her lashes. She quickened her steps, only to find the fog thickening, blurring street signs and turning familiar lanes into disorienting shapes. An uneasy tremor stirred inside her. She paused beneath a flickering lamp, squinting through the haze, trying to recall which turning led to her lodging. The world seemed to narrow into drifting white. And then, the distant rumble of wheels. A pair of carriage lanterns glowed faintly through the fog, approaching with the slow, deliberate pace of a traveler moving through unfamiliar territory. Rachel stepped back toward the nearest building, prepared to wait until it passed. But as the carriage drew nearer, its outline sharpened, the dark panels gleaming with recognition. The Ashbourne crest. Before she could retreat further, the carriage halted. The door opened with a soft click, and the Duke emerged, his tall form cutting through the mist like a figure carved out of winter itself. Snowflakes settled upon the dark fall of his cloak and melted against the warmth of his breath. He took a single step toward her, though not so near as to corner or presume. "Miss Fairhaven," he said, voice quiet yet resonant in the muffled air, "you are far from home and the fog grows treacherous. Allow me to see you safely to your door." Rachel's pulse fluttered in confusion. "How do you know where I live?" she asked before she could restrain the question. Regret flickered across his features, softening the strong lines of his face. "Not from spying, I assure you. Your landlady recognized my driver when he delivered the rose." She spoke freely. Rachel absorbed this in silence. It explained enough without alarming her further. Still she hesitated. Accepting his help felt dangerous, as though each small agreement might unravel the independence she fought to maintain. "I can manage," she murmured. "London fog is no stranger to me." A faint smile touched his lips, though it carried sadness rather than amusement. "Miss Fairhaven," he said, "even the bravest soldier may lose his way in a storm. Please, allow me this courtesy." His sincerity disarmed her. Reluctance softened into reluctant acceptance. She nodded once. The Duke guided her to the carriage, offering his hand but not imposing it. She placed her fingers lightly upon his only long enough to steady her step. Inside, the warmth startled her. A small brazier glowed softly in the corner, scents of pine and leather mingling with the faint sweetness of melting snow. She settled into the far seat, keeping her back straight, her gloved hands folded tightly. The Duke took the opposite seat, leaving a respectable space between them. Yet the smallness of the carriage, the hush of the fog pressing against the windows, and the subtle sway of the wheels made the air feel charged with an intimacy neither had intended. For several moments they said nothing. The world outside dissolved into mist, leaving only the muted clatter of hooves and the soft glow of the carriage lamp. Finally the Duke spoke. "I fear the rose has unsettled you," he said gently. "If it caused discomfort, you need only say the word." Rachel studied her hands. "It did not cause discomfort," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty, "but it caused confusion. I do not understand why you, a man admired by all, would take notice of me." He met her gaze steadily, his silver hair catching the lamplight like threads of frost. "Admiration," he murmured, "is not the same as understanding. Nor does it offer companionship." She felt the words settle deeply, their quiet weight revealing a loneliness she had never imagined in a man celebrated by the entire city. He continued, voice low and steady. "During the war, I learned how quickly admiration fades when the cannons fire. And how often a man, despite all attention, may walk unseen." She had never heard a titled man speak with such candor. Slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to ask, "What is it you believe you see in me?" His expression shifted, not into softness but into something quietly reverent. "You look at me as though I am only human," he said. "Not a war hero. Not a duke. Not a prize. Merely a man." Her breath caught. The sincerity of the words trembled between them, fragile as thawing ice. He leaned back slightly, hands resting loosely on his knees, as if offering distance even while revealing vulnerability. "You cannot know how rare that is," he added. Rachel's thoughts tangled. She wanted to guard herself. She wanted to step back. Yet she also wanted to understand why her presence unsettled him, and why his unsettled her. She looked toward the window where fog pressed like a living thing against the glass. "I avoid powerful men," she whispered. "They have shaped too many women's lives without consequence." A shadow passed over his eyes, memory or regret, she could not tell. "Then I must endeavor not to be one of them," he said softly. "Tell me, Miss Fairhaven, is it power you mistrust? Or men who wield it carelessly?" She turned back to him slowly. "Both," she whispered. "Though one is merely the hand and the other the weapon." He exhaled as though her answer wounded him with its truth. For a long moment neither spoke. The carriage slowed as they approached her street, the wheels crunching softly over patches of frozen slush. A lantern flickered outside her lodging, casting a warm but lonely circle of light upon the snow. As the carriage drew to a halt, she felt a strange ache settle beneath her ribs, the ache of wanting to leave and wanting to stay in the same breath. The Duke shifted, his voice almost a whisper. "Miss Fairhaven, if distance is what you require, I will honor it. But I ask only this, do not shut me out entirely." The earnestness in his tone struck her like a blow. She reached for the door, her gloved fingers trembling slightly. "I do not know what I require," she said, her voice barely steady. "That is precisely the danger." She stepped down onto the snow-covered street, the cold biting her ankles through her thin boots. The Duke remained inside the carriage, watching her with an expression she could not decipher. As she turned toward her lodging, a soft gust of wind stirred the hem of her gown, and behind her, the Duke's voice drifted into the night, low and almost broken. "Rachel, please?" She froze, her heartbeat thundering. He had never spoken her name before. She did not look back. But the sound of it, whispered, yearning, unmistakably personal, followed her all the way to her door. London thrived on scandal the way winter thrived on frost, each whisper settling silently but sharply across every surface of society. By the following week, Rachel Fairhaven discovered she had become a character in a story she had never agreed to tell. Rumors, slick as ice, slithered their way into households that had once smiled upon her inquiries. A note from a reputable family informed her that the governess position she had hoped for had been filled, though she knew it had not been. Another letter, this one trembling with false sympathy, suggested she avoid appearances in Mayfair until matters settled. And at the bakery that morning, 2 women had glanced pointedly at her and whispered, "Ambitious little trapper, isn't she?" She could have ignored it all, might have endured it, if it had not been for the final blow. A sealed envelope slipped beneath her door. She opened it with shaking hands, expecting a post advertisement or perhaps a bill. Instead, she found a letter written in her own name, addressed to the Duchess of Wetherell, boldly requesting an audience with the Duke, to discuss our mutual intentions. Rachel's heart lurched. The handwriting was not hers. The implication was obscene. Someone wished to ruin her, thoroughly and without remorse. Her breath shook as she folded the letter, pressing it hard against her chest as if pressure could undo its venom. She knew who would be blamed. She knew who would be named the scheming, grasping creature. Not the author. Not society. Her. Always her. A hollow ache formed behind her ribs, pulling her downward until she had to sit. The small room around her blurred, her humble bed, the lone candle on the table, her worn gloves drying near the hearth. Everything she owned might fit inside a single trunk, yet even that meager dignity was being stripped away by strangers who had never bothered to learn her name before tearing it apart. By midday, she heard the roar of carriage wheels outside, too forceful to belong to any ordinary caller. The ground seemed to tremble as boots struck the pavement. She froze, dread thickening inside her, but before she could rise, voices erupted down the hall, astonished, flustered, anxious. And then her door opened. The Duke of Ashbourne filled the doorway, snow melting in crystalline beads along the shoulders of his dark coat, his breath turning to steam in the cold-tinged air of her lodging. But it was not his appearance that shook her. It was his expression. Controlled fury, banked beneath a soldier's discipline, smoldered in his eyes like embers pressed too long under snow. He held the forged letter in his gloved hand. "Who sent this?" he asked, his voice a low storm. She stood, knees trembling. "I do not know. It was slipped beneath my door." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, though he left enough space between them to preserve propriety. Even so, his presence filled the room with heat, intensity, and something dangerously close to protectiveness. "Do you understand?" he said, nearly whispering, "what damage this could cause to your reputation? To your livelihood?" She met his gaze with quiet devastation. "I am beginning to understand," she murmured. "More each day." He exhaled slowly as though wrestling with himself. "This goes beyond malice. This is an attack." She swallowed. "Because of the ballroom?" "Because of everything," he said. "Because you refused to play their games. Because you refused me." The air thickened with unspoken meaning. Rachel looked away before the weight of his gaze crushed the fragile composure she clung to. "I did not refuse you," she whispered. "I refused what your attention would bring." He took a single step closer. Snow light from the window caught in the silver of his hair, softening the hard planes of his face. "And are you suffering the very consequences you hoped to avoid?" Her throat tightened. She could not deny it. He saw the truth flicker through her eyes and his expression broke, just slightly but enough. "Rachel," he said, her name reverent, "I should have protected you sooner." She shook her head, fighting a rising ache. "It is not your burden." "It is," he answered, "if my presence brought it upon you." Before she could respond, a sudden knock thundered through the building, a harsh, imperious sound that reverberated along the thin walls. Rachel startled. The Duke's jaw went rigid. Another knock followed, this one accompanied by a shrill female voice saying, "We know she is inside. Open at once." Rachel blanched. The Duke turned sharply toward the door, every inch of him transforming, not the gentle, sorrow-struck man who had stepped into her room, but the commander who had led battalions across foreign soil. "Stay behind me," he said. She did not argue. The door burst open before he could reach it. Lady Wetherell, flanked by 2 society matrons, stormed inside without so much as a breath of courtesy. Her eyes widened upon seeing the Duke within the small room. "Your Grace," she gasped, "so it is true." Rachel stepped forward, face pale but determined. "You have no right to intrude." "No right?" Lady Wetherell snapped. "You summon a Duke to your quarters and expect us to believe." "Enough." The Duke's voice sliced through the hysteria like a saber's edge. "You will not speak to Miss Fairhaven in that manner." Lady Wetherell blinked, stunned into silence. He stepped between them, tall, immovable, unyielding. "The letter was forged," he said coldly. "Forged with malicious intent. And if any of you had an ounce of honor, you would seek the true culprit rather than delight in cruelty." The women shrank back, but none dared leave. Rachel found her voice only because his presence steadied her. "I never asked for his visits," she said quietly. "I sought only a life of my own." Lady Wetherell sniffed. "Yet here he stands alone with you. Explain that." The Duke inhaled slowly, controlled only by force. Then he spoke words that silenced the entire room. "I came because she is being hunted by rumor, and because I will not allow society to destroy her for its amusement." The matrons exchanged stunned glances. The Duke continued, voice gentler but no less resolute. "Miss Fairhaven has shown nothing but dignity. The dishonor lies not with her, but with those who would torment an innocent woman." The accusation struck like a blow. Lady Wetherell stiffened, color rising hotly in her cheeks. But before she could retaliate, the Duke turned, not to the intruders but to Rachel. "If you leave London," he said softly, "you will do so believing that I brought you only suffering. And I cannot permit that." Rachel's breath caught. "Your Grace." "No," he said, stepping closer, his voice breaking with emotion he could no longer conceal. "You want nothing from me. Nothing from my title, my wealth, my influence. And for that reason, Rachel Fairhaven, you are the only woman I have ever truly wanted." The room fell into stunned silence. Even the winter wind outside seemed to halt. Rachel swayed, every defense she had built trembling under the weight of his confession. But before she could speak, another knock echoed through the building, this one deeper, heavier, unmistakably official. A male voice called out, "Duke of Ashbourne? Are you inside?" Rachel turned toward him, fear rippling through her. The Duke's expression darkened with realization. "They have come," he said quietly, "and they believe I am compromising you." The final word trembled in the cold air between them, leaving the truth and the danger hanging like a blade over both their futures. The harsh rap of the constable's fist reverberated through the thin walls, silencing every breath in the room. Rachel felt her pulse thrum in her throat, each heartbeat sharp with dread. Lady Wetherell and the matrons shrank back instinctively, their earlier bravado dissolving beneath the weight of impending scandal. The Duke stood utterly still, as though bracing himself for the culmination of a storm he had long anticipated but hoped never to face. His gaze found Rachel's, and what she saw there, fear not for himself but for her, struck deeper than any accusation London could hurl. The door swung open before a reply could be uttered, and 2 constables entered with brisk, apologetic precision, their breath fogging in the cold that swept through the narrow hallway behind them. "Your Grace," the taller of the 2 said, lowering his cap with rigid respect. "Forgive the intrusion, but rumors have reached the magistrate's office. We are obliged to verify your welfare, and the welfare of the lady." Rachel's cheeks burned at the implication. Lady Wetherell's fan snapped shut with a vicious flick, though her eyes glittered with unrestrained anticipation. The matrons leaned forward, breathless vultures awaiting a feast of disgrace. The Duke's jaw tightened with barely checked fury, but his voice remained steady. "My welfare is intact," he said. "Miss Fairhaven has acted with nothing but propriety. I am the one who intruded upon her home." The constables exchanged uncertain glances. "But, Your Grace," the shorter murmured, "it is being said that you've been drawn into a compromising situation." Rachel stepped forward, trembling yet resolute. "This is untrue," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I would never entrap any man, least of all his Grace. My name is being used for destroyed." She lifted her chin despite the heat prickling her eyes. "I have been harassed, hunted by rumor, refused work, and humiliated for things I did not do. Her words, filled with quiet anguish, pierced the room like a blade. Even the constable seemed moved. The Duke's eyes brimmed not with pity, but with a fierce pride that made her breath falter. "I can attest to every word she speaks," the Duke said, his voice a low thunder. "And if society seeks someone to blame, let it blame me." The matrons gasped. Lady Wetherell stepped back as if struck. Rachel stared at him, heart pounding painfully. "Do not sacrifice yourself," she whispered. He turned to her with a softness she had never seen. "If sacrifice is required, it is one I offer willingly." Without waiting for permission or audience, he strode past the constables and out into the street. Snowflakes swept around him like shards of white fire, and his cloak billowed behind him as though the winter wind itself answered his call. The street had filled, drawn by rumor like moths to flame. Neighbors, beggars, merchants, and society members alike had gathered, craning their necks to witness the downfall of a duke and the ruin of a rector's daughter. The Duke stepped into the center of them all, his breath steaming in the frigid air. He removed his gloves deliberately, as though shedding the last remnants of silence he had allowed to stand between them. "Hear me," he called, his commanding voice slicing through the crowd. "Enough of your stories and speculation. I will tell you the truth." Silence fell instantly, thick as snowfall. Miss Rachel Fairhaven invited no scandal. She sought no attention. Everything she has endured, your cruelty, your whispers, your lies, has been a punishment for merely crossing paths with me. He paused, letting the words sink into every corner of the street. "I alone brought trouble to her door. I alone am to blame for your obsession with her name. And I will not permit her to pay the price for my presence." Rachel stood at the threshold of her lodging, breath caught between awe and terror. Every word he spoke pulled her closer, unraveling every barrier she had tried so hard to build. The Duke lifted his voice once more. "If anyone wishes to accuse her, they must first accuse me. If anyone dares claim she ensnared me, they must reckon with the truth. I am the one who pursued her." Gasps rippled through the crowd like cracks in ice. "And why did I pursue her?" His voice softened, deepened, the wind seeming to hush around him. "Because she is the only woman in London who wants nothing from me, and therefore the only woman I cannot live without." The confession struck the crowd like lightning. Rachel's knees weakened. She clutched the doorframe, breath trembling, as every raw truth she had feared suddenly stood in the open, luminous and terrifying. The constables bowed stiffly. "We have heard enough, Your Grace." They stepped aside and retreated, leaving the Duke standing alone before an audience that no longer knew how to breathe. Lady Wetherell, now pale, sputtered, "But surely you cannot mean to align yourself with a woman of—" "A woman of dignity?" the Duke cut sharply. "Of courage? Of honesty? Yes, precisely that." He turned then, snow swirling around him, and faced Rachel. The world blurred, narrowed, trembled. As he approached, the onlookers parted like the sea before him. When he reached her door, he paused, not touching her, not presuming, simply standing close enough for his voice to reach her alone. "Rachel," he murmured, "you deserve freedom from this torment. But I cannot let you walk away believing you were merely a casualty of my world. I meant every word I said." Her eyes glistened with 1,000 unshed feelings. "I do not know how to trust a future tied to power," she whispered. "Then trust the man," he said softly. "Not the title." He removed a small silver ring from his pocket, a simple band worn with age. "This belonged to my mother. I have carried it through battles and winters colder than this one. I carry it still because it is the only thing that ever felt like home." Rachel's breath shook, her heart unraveling thread by thread. "If you will have me," he said, "I will spend every day proving that you are not an ornament to my life, but the life itself." The crowd leaned in, silent and breathless. Snow fell gently, soft as blessing. Rachel's fingers trembled as she extended her hand, slowly, hesitantly, yet with a courage born of everything she had endured. The Duke slid the ring onto her finger, awe flickering across his features as though he too could hardly believe this moment existed. A murmur surged through the crowd, astonishment, admiration, and perhaps even approval. The Duke lowered his forehead gently to hers. "My heart," he whispered, "is yours." A single tear escaped her lashes, melting instantly in the cold. And just as their lips were about to meet in a kiss the winter dusk would remember, another carriage rounded the corner at speed, stopping abruptly before them. A footman leapt down breathless, calling out, "Your Grace." An urgent message from Parliament. The Duke stiffened, his hand tightening around Rachel's. She looked up at him, fear whispering through her veins. "Go," she murmured. He shook his head. Not without you. The footman approached, extending a sealed letter stamped with the royal crest. The Duke broke the seal. His expression shifted, grave, shadowed, and unreadable. Rachel's breath caught. "What is it?" she whispered. He lifted his eyes to hers, eyes now carrying the weight of a nation. "Rachel," he said quietly, "everything is about to change.